I'm sure we'll learn a lot this evening. And without further ado, I want to introduce Flossie Mitchell.
Thank you, Nancy. Good evening. Let's try that again. Good evening. Yeah. In case you're wondering, we left this so that you could just wonder. Professor Tatum said that she would rather have, we were hoping to have a wireless mic and that wasn't available, but she wants the ability to roam and wander. So we moved ourselves down here. You can just look at that as a backdrop. For some of you who may not know, I know Nancy said I'm Flossie Mitchell. I also happen to be the Dean of Students. No, that's fine. And it was really a pleasure to have the opportunity to work with the Kirkland Project in sponsoring Professor Tatum's visit. And I have been asked to introduce her, which is definitely a pleasure for me. Since 1989, Professor Tatum has been a member of the psychology department at Mount Holyoke College. And in case she didn't have enough to do in that role, in 1998 she also took on the role of Dean of the College, which is a position that bridges sort of the academic world and the student affairs world. So this is a woman who has a great deal on her plate. She focuses her work on race relations in America, particularly black families in white America, racial identity in teens, and race in the classroom. A clinical psychologist and professor of psychology and education who maintains a consulting practice, Professor Tatum earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from Wesleyan University, where she mentioned to me her son has started as a first-year student this fall, and a master's degree and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan. For almost 20 years, Professor Tatum has taught a class in the psychology of racism. And in her book, with which I hope we are all familiar, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race, Professor Tatum applies her expertise on race to argue that straight talk about racial identity is essential to the nation. This book, which uses the latest research and real-life examples, including experiences of Professor Tatum's sons, Jonathan and David, the book not only dispels race as taboo, but gives readers a new lens for understanding race as a developmental factor experienced by all of us. In a live online discussion, which was sponsored by the Association of American Colleges and Universities, Professor Tatum stated, "I am delighted to hear, as I often do, that people are reading my book in groups. It seems like it has provided a way for people to enter a conversation about race and racism. The title is a hook for some people, but then they discover there is much more in the book than just the answer to the question." Clearly, that has been the case here at Hamilton College. Professor Tatum's book was required summer reading for the class of 2004, and during the orientation last month, first-year students met in faculty-led groups to discuss the book. Tonight, we are most fortunate to have with us the author of this important book, and it is indeed my pleasure to present to you Beverly Daniel Tatum.
There is a reason, actually, I didn't want to be on the stage, and that is because I'm hoping we will have a conversation, and I find that it's easier to talk to people when you are in closer proximity to them than when you're sitting on the stage. When you're sitting on the stage, people expect you to talk for however many minutes, and then maybe you get to ask a few questions. But in fact, my hope is that we will have a conversation almost from the very beginning. The title of my book, as you all know, is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race. And that is a long title, and because it's a long title, sometimes people refer to it only by the first half. Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And I always like to emphasize the second half, and Other Conversations About Race, because it's really the conversation part that I think is most important. The particular question is, of course, of interest to some people, and there are other questions that I try to address in the book. But my real goal in writing it was to engage my readers and hopefully their friends and other people in their environment, as the quote alluded to, in engaging in a dialogue about what is often a topic of great silence, about which there has been a lot of silence. One of the reasons why I think conversation is important is because you can't solve a problem. I think racism is a problem, I should just say that. And I think racism is a problem, and I think racism is a problem in our society, and generally speaking, my observation is that you can't solve problems without being able to talk about them. So that in being able to engage in conversation about this topic, it seems to me to be a very important one. Let me just ask, how many of you have actually read some, if not all, of the book? This is great. So certainly the vast majority, I didn't, there might have been a few of you whose hands were not up, but certainly a lot of people have read the book. And what I think is particularly delightful about that is that often when I'm invited to give presentations, I feel like there's a certain context I have to set before we can really start talking. I need to talk about some assumptions that I have, and I need to explain those things and, lay out the groundwork for the conversation. And then I can open the floor for questions and for dialogue. What's really exciting to me is that I don't have to do that here, at least not too much. I'll do it a little bit, because you all have read at least some portion, if not the whole book, and that gives us a common basis to begin our dialogue right away. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that. I do want to say that I've had the opportunity to have some conversation already on your campus, and I have been had dinner with a group of folks, some faculty, some students, and some of them said, some really interesting questions have emerged from the conversations we've been having about your book. So I'm really excited to hear what some of those questions are. I also know that in an audience like this, or in an auditorium like this, there can be some hesitation about asking those questions. So I would just like to invite all of you to really, take the plunge and put your question on the table, whatever it might be, because I do hope we'll be able to have a conversation. Before we do that, I want to ask a question, which if you've read the book, you will recognize, but I ask this question everywhere I go, and I like to ask it here. How many of you have had difficult conversations with other people about a race-related topic? Okay, a lot of hands up. When you think about those conversations, what emotion most characterizes them? You can just call something out.
Anger.
Shame, anger, fear, defense. So far I've heard shame, anger, fear, defensiveness. Anxiety, embarrassment, frustration. What else? That's enough, Shame, anxiety, embarrassment, fear, frustration. I may have left somebody's word out, but these are not comfortable feelings. Most of us try to avoid shame-inducing, fear-provoking, anxiety-raising, embarrassing situations. And so I'd just like to acknowledge that many people have those feelings. It makes sense that we try to avoid conversations that provoke them, and yet at the same time, as I've said earlier, it seems to me we can't really move beyond the difficult issues of race relations in our society without being able to engage in these conversations. I think that you already, as far as I can see, are ahead of the game in the sense that you've had some of those conversations already. In your faculty groups, in your classrooms, some of those conversations have already taken place. So I'm hoping that we have time to pump a little bit, but that I would just like to invite a recognition that sometimes these conversations are awkward, but that doesn't mean we can't have them. And one of the things I would like to just reiterate, though if you've read the book you know this, that I feel like all of us are struggling with the fact that we have misinformation, that we have all been exposed to misinformation about people different from ourselves, and that misinformation often takes the form of stereotypes, distorted information. We suffer as the result of omitted information, information that just wasn't included about people different from ourselves. I also like to say, and we talked a little bit about this at dinner, that we also get misinformation about people like ourselves. So the fact that I am African American doesn't mean that I didn't get misinformed about other African Americans, or the fact that somebody is Asian or Korean or Latino or Native American or European American, whatever your background is, We've all been exposed to misinformation, and that misinformation sometimes leads to prejudice, often leads to prejudice. How many of you have heard somebody say, "There's not a prejudiced bone in my body"? I also like to say, check again. You know, the fact is that we all have misconceptions that often translate into prejudice, and as a consequence of that, we all have work to do. I guess that's what I want to say here, that we all have work to do. It's not our fault that we have been misinformed. It's not our fault that we've been exposed to stereotypes. None of us is to blame that this is part of the socialization process in the context of the society in which we're presently living. However, and certainly as a parent, I would like to say that I had protected my children from misinformation, but I know that's not true. You know, I know that they have still, despite my best efforts, been exposed to stereotypes, omissions, distortions, and they will have their own work to do around these issues as they get older. But having said that one, we all got it. It's not our fault, but we've all been impacted by this process. And that we are all hurt by it in significant ways. Whether that's in terms of the shame, the embarrassment, the fear, the anxiety we've experienced in a particular context or in particular conversations, or in other more tangible or perhaps less tangible ways. I believe we've all been impacted by racism, and to that extent, all benefit from interrupting it. And I hope during the course of our conversation tonight that we can talk very specifically about ways that each of us can use our sphere of influence to begin to interrupt or continue to interrupt the cycle of racism, to create a more just, a less damaging, more positive environment for everyone. So with those opening remarks, those are very brief, but I just want to say that they represent the kernel of what is embedded in the opening chapter of my book. I would like to really open the floor for questions. I know there are some. I've been hearing already what some of them are, and I would really like us to begin our conversation right away. So if you've got a question about something you read in the book, I'd like to hear what it is. Yes. One of the reasons I want to come down here with my one mic.
There's a section in the book talking about passive anti-racism. Passive. Well, actually, that's my question. Okay. Is there such a thing as passive anti-racism? Or does it overlap with passive racism?
Okay. So the question is there such a thing as passive anti-racism? And maybe we should start out by talking about the fact that in the book, at the beginning of the book, I talk about the fact that racism is a system of advantage based on race. But it manifests itself in a variety of ways, right? We can talk about individual racism, we can talk about cultural racism, we can talk about institutional racism. But in that context, one of the things that I talk about the fact, and maybe some of you have struggled with this definition of racism as a system of advantage based on race. A lot of people do. But if you have thought about that definition, one of the things I try to say is that the issue is not, that for many people, when they hear that R word, when they hear the word racism or racist, when they hear that word, they often, you tell me, when you hear the word racist, what do you think of usually? Right, some guy in a white robe. Right, white robes, burning crosses. We think of Klan activity, we think of hate crimes, we think of name-calling, we think of what Peggy McIntosh has referred to as individual acts of meanness, right? You know. So if that's your only way of thinking about racism, the definition, racism as a system of advantage based on race, will seem quite unfamiliar. But when you think about racism as not only individual acts of meanness, if you think about racist behavior as not only individual acts of meanness, I am, again, assuming everybody's read the book, so I don't have to go on and on about the definition, system of advantage based on race, but if you understand racism as a set of assumptions, behaviors, institutional policies and practices which systematically advantage one group, systematically disadvantage other groups on the basis of racial group membership, then you can think about racist behavior as those things which reinforce that system. And name-calling, hate crimes, individual acts of meanness reinforce that system, but those aren't the only things that reinforce that system. leaving people of color off the syllabus reinforces that system. Not speaking up when you hear somebody telling racial jokes reinforces that system. Not objecting to policies that, you know, I'm going to use a very concrete example. Lending policies. How many of you are familiar with, you know, the various, I use some examples of this in the book, but how many of you are familiar with the term redlining? Okay, not everybody is. So redlining refers to the practice of some banks sometimes or insurance companies of essentially designating certain areas with which they do not want to do business. You know, sort of putting a red line, literally drawing a red line around an area on a map. Because there may be the feeling that this is a high-risk area in terms of insurance policies. You know, maybe there's a lot of vandalism, so it's going to be a high-risk area in terms of insuring people, or maybe it's a high-risk area in terms of there's a high level perhaps of loan default, so therefore it's a high-risk area. And if an area has been redlined, and often that lining process is associated with racial group memberships, so if that area has been redlined, it's going to be difficult if you live in that area to get a loan or to get insurance, etc. Now you yourself may be very creditworthy. You might have a good job, you might have never had any problem with your credit, you might be very creditworthy, but simply because you live in a particular area that has been designated in this way, it may be harder for you to get a loan. So that's an institutional policy in practice, right? But if you are the bank officer, individual decisions are being made all the time. Institution policies are enforced by individuals. So let's imagine I'm the individual loan officer and I am trying to decide whether the Latino person in front of me who lives in this area that's been designated as sort of a high-risk area is a good credit risk. I need to make a decision about that. You know, questioning my assumptions, not questioning my stereotypes maybe about that group, not questioning my institution's policies and practices, you know, just doing business as usual may not be an act of prejudice on my part. Well, sort of not questioning my own stereotypes, I would say might be prejudicial, but it might not be an act of maliciousness. You know, I might not be, you know, I'm not going to give, I might not be sitting in my office saying, over my dead body will I give a loan to anybody from that group. That might not be my attitude at all. But my passivity in terms of not questioning the policy, not raising questions about, well, why is it that we're not lending to creditworthy folks in this neighborhood? Why is it that we're not, you know, doing more outreach in that community? Why is it that there are fewer services available in that community? Not asking those questions, being passive, also reinforces that system of advantage. So when we think about racism, we can think about racist behavior as both actively racist, but you can also think about racist behavior or attitudes, or I'm going to use the word behavior here, as passive, sometimes passive behavior. Not taking action can reinforce that system. So then the question is, well, can you interrupt the cycle of racism? The analogy I use in the book, if we think of the cycle of racism, the socialization we receive growing up, the way it gets reinforced, the messages we get growing up, and then the way we internalize those messages, and then later repeat them or pass them on to our children, sometimes without thinking. If we think about that process as a cycle, you can think about that, the analogy I use in the book is a cycle like the moving walkway at the airport. Right? Having just come from the airport today, you know, there's a moving walkway at the airport. You can just stand still on that walkway and you get carried along. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to be actively moving. You can be very passive and still you get carried along. And if we think about the cycle of racism as like that, as being something that just carries you along, whether you are moving or not, then we can think about how would you interrupt that process. If you wanted to interrupt that process, the thing you'd need to do would be to do what? If you don't want to go where that moving walkway is taking you, how would you interrupt that process? You'd get off. Now, how would you get off? You have to walk the other way, right? Not only do you have to walk the other way, you have to walk the other way faster than the conveyor belt is going, right? You could just turn around, right? But if you just turn around and don't walk, you're just being carried backwards, right? But you're still going in that same direction. So you have to turn the other way, and you have to move more quickly than the conveyor belt is moving. You have to be very active in that context. And in the same way, so when we think about interrupting the cycle of racism, we have to be very active. Now, there's a range of actions that a person can take, you know. Sometimes my students in my psychology of racism class will say, well, you know, what about writing a check to an organization like the Southern Poverty Law Center? You know, that's not very active. Isn't that passive anti-racism? It's an anti-racist act to support an organization like that, but it's pretty passive. Isn't that an example of passive anti-racism? I would say it's still an action. You know, maybe writing a check is a smaller action than, you know, organizing a boycott or, you know, leading a demonstration, but it's still an action. It requires effort and intention on your part, a decision. And interrupting somebody's joke is an action. There's a wide range and a continuum along which actions might fall, but action is required. So the question you're asking is there such a thing as passive anti-racism? I would say not. Because if that passive anti-racism to me is like turning around and not moving. You know, you're not looking at the racism, but you're not interrupting it either. You know, and in your silence, silence can be collusion, silence can reinforce. And so the system of advantage continues unabated unless we are acting. Other questions or comments? Yes?
My question, in your book you talk about internalized racism and it's in the beginning and then you go on to issues of black and white. And I was just wondering how do issues of internalized racism within like the black community or the Latino community, how do they overlap with your general definition of racism, or if it doesn't overlap?
Okay, so the question is about internalized racism and what's the relationship of internalized racism to the bigger definition, or the definition of racism I was just using. So internalized racism basically speaks to the phenomenon that you observe in communities of color. And you know, I'm talking about internalized racism here, and I'm talking about the cycle of racism. We could talk about other isms as well, and I just want to take a moment to connect to other isms. So, for example, when I talk about racism as a system of advantage based on race, in the same way we could talk about sexism as a system of advantage based on sex or gender. We could talk about classism as a system of advantage based on socioeconomic status. We could talk about heterosexism as a system of advantage based on sexual orientation. We could talk about ableism as a system of advantage based on physical or intellectual or emotional abilities of different sorts. We could talk about ageism as a system of advantage based on age. Okay, so so all of these isms have things in common. But when we talk about an internalized ism, whatever the ism is, in this case internalized racism, what we're talking about is the phenomenon by which members of the targeted group, and by that I mean the group that is disadvantaged by the ism. So in the relationship to racism, I'm talking about people of color. So when we talk about internalized racism, what we're talking about is the ways in which people of color may internalize the negative messages about their own groups. So speaking, for example, as an African-American woman, if I grew up with particular messages about African-American women, negative messages about African-American women, some of which I came to believe, that would be an example of internalized racism. An example that I bet will be familiar to many of you that I think is a good example of internalized racism is the following. When, maybe it doesn't happen so much at the college level, but you will hear this in high schools or in junior high schools. When a black student is doing very well in school, sometimes other black students will accuse that black student of what? Exactly, acting white, being white, acting white. Okay, so now why would I say, I would just like to pose this question to you. If a black student is doing very well in school, and that black student's friends, black friends, are saying, oh, so-and-so, maybe they're not his friends or her friends, but you know, other black students are saying, so-and-so is, quote, acting white. Why would I suggest that that might be a very commonly observed example of internalized racism? What do you think? What's the message that's being conveyed?
You have to be like ignorant to be black, you know? So if you're not ignorant, then you're not black anymore. Now you are white.
So the message is, when somebody says somebody's doing well in school and other people are saying so-and-so is acting white, embedded in that is the assumption that doing well in school is exclusively white behavior, and that that's not something that black people do, right? And that, to me, is clearly an example of having internalized some negative messages about your own group, and the result of misinformation or missing information. You know, if those black students knew about all the black people who had achieved intellectually, you know, throughout history, then it would not seem odd to perform academically, right? And it would not be seen as exclusively white behavior, but it's an example of internalized racism. So, and so I hope that's making my point clear in terms of internalized racism is about internalizing the negative messages about your own group, coming to believe them as true and acting out on them. Now you can see, that's just one example, the acting white. You know, it's just one example of what we might think of as internalized racism. There are other examples we could think about. We could talk about, for example, what's sometimes referred to in communities of color, and this is not exclusive to black communities. You can find it in Latino communities, to some degree in some Asian communities, what is sometimes referred to as colorism. You know, where the lighter skinned you are, the more positively that's viewed. You know, so being a light-skinned African-American, it might be viewed more positively in an African-American community than being darker-skinned. And I have heard Latino students talk about a similar phenomenon, and I've heard Asian students talk about a similar phenomenon. That the more closely the person resembles someone of European ancestry, the more valued that is. And you can see that, again, as another example of having internalized racist messages, having internalized messages about the assumed superiority of the dominant group. Have I answered your question, or is there more to it?
No,
Okay. Other questions or concerns? Things you've thought about as you consider these issues? Yes, is there a hand? Okay, well, I'm coming back to you, but I also want to say that, you know, we want to give other people opportunities.
Okay. There was a lot of questions in my class about how do white people go about being anti-racist, but I also want to add to that, since black people do not benefit from racism as a system of advantage based on race, can black or people of color be anti-racist?
Is the question, can people of color be racist? Or how do people of color be anti-racist? Okay. Right, okay. Well, the question is, let me speak to both questions, because I know that other question is lurking out there, okay? So the question is, if racism is a system of advantage based on race, and people of color are not systematically advantaged in the context of racism as it currently operates, then can people of color be racist? That's one question. And then the second, that wasn't the question you asked, but that is a question people often ask, so I want to address it. And the other question was, can people of color be anti-racist? I think anybody can be anti-racist, because when we think about the system of it, if we think about what anti-racism is, I think about anti-racism as interrupting the cycle of racism. Anybody can interrupt the cycle of racism. So to the extent that someone is working to interrupt that cycle, I would say they're being anti-racist. Okay. Now, the question is, can a person of color be racist? To me, we need to break that question down. That because we don't all use the term racism in the same way, right? If when you're using the term racism, what you're meaning is individual acts of meanness, can anybody be individually mean? Absolutely. There's no question that anybody can engage in acts of racial bigotry, anybody can engage in name-calling, anybody can engage in hate crimes on the basis of race. There are many examples of this, okay? So if you're talking about racism as individual acts of meanness, then absolutely anybody can be racist, including people of color. If you're talking about racism as a system of advantage, then it doesn't make sense to talk about people of color as racist because they're not systematically advantaged. It's just, you know, it doesn't make sense logically. So there's a big if there. You have to accept the definition of racism as a system of advantage based on race. But if you're operating with that definition, it does not make sense to talk about people of color as benefiting systematically or being advantaged systematically by race. Now sometimes when I talk about this, some people really struggle with this point. How many of you have really struggled with this point? It doesn't surprise me, because I've given enough of these talks and had enough conversations with people about my book to know that many people, and before I wrote the book, in my classes, to know that many people struggle with this point. But the point really hinges on acknowledging the system of advantage. And not everybody sees themselves as, not all white people see themselves as advantaged, right? And not all white people are advantaged to the same degree. One of the things I like to talk about is the fact that we all have multiple identities. And when we talk about, I already made the point about, you can talk about sexism as a system of advantage based on gender and, all the other isms I mentioned. We all have multiple identities. And, by that I mean, for example, I can describe myself, I already have a couple times referred to myself tonight as African American. I can also describe myself as female. I can also describe myself as heterosexual. I can also describe myself as someone who is raised middle class, is still middle class. I can describe myself as someone who is able-bodied. I can describe myself as Christian. There are a lot of different ways I can describe myself, and in some of those categories, I am systematically advantaged. As we stand here on the, eve of Rosh Hashanah, I am oozing Christian privilege, right? And I can talk about my privilege as a heterosexual. And I can talk about my privilege as somebody who grew up and continues to be middle class. And I can talk about my privilege as someone for whom English is my first language. There are lots of ways in which I can describe myself as systematically advantaged. I am, however, systematically disadvantaged by my race, by my gender. Now, am I as systematically disadvantaged by my race and gender as I would be if I were poor? No, I'm not. I have my class privilege buffers some of that other stuff, to some degree, not entirely. Am I as systematically advantaged as I would be if I were a lesbian? I would be disadvantaged, systematically disadvantaged if I were a lesbian. So the fact that I'm heterosexual buffers me a little bit, and if I were black, my experience as a black woman heterosexual is different than it would be if I were a black lesbian. So we have to think about our identities holistically. And so when I talk to a white, I'm going to share with you a conversation I had, actually. I started saying, when I talk to a white male student, for example, who says, I grew up poor, what privilege do I have? I want to acknowledge that white male student who grew up poor has a different level of advantage than a white male student who grew up rich. But there is still some advantage embedded in being white and male, even if you're poor. And so let me share with you a conversation I had recently with a student. Hamilton is not the only college. You might be interested to know where my book was the first-year assignment. Another college where the book was the first-year assignment is Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I spoke not long ago at Hampshire. And there was a young man at Hampshire who, we were having this, similar kind of affair, a forum like this, and I was trying to engage the students in some conversation, and this student stood up and said, I grew up in an inner city neighborhood. I went to, he was a very light-skinned person with blonde hair, blue eyes. Looking at him, I would have identified him as white, right? He said, I do not like to be identified as white. I grew up in a black neighborhood. I went to, a poor inner city school. A lot of my friends were black. I don't like being referred to as white because it represents to me things that are not true about me. When people say you're white, there's an assumption of middle class status. There's an assumption of, access to educational opportunities that I didn't have. It bothers me, and I don't think we should talk about racial categories at all, and certainly the white one's not working for me. And so we had, it was very interesting dialogue, and there were other students who had opinions about that and, talked about it. And at the end of the evening, several people came up to me to have their book signed, and we were having conversations, and this student came up and he hung around. He was like the last student to leave. And as we were talking to one another, one of the things he said to me was, you know, I really don't like these racial categories and I resist them. And one of the ways I resist them, he says, whenever I'm asked to check off one of those boxes, I check the black box. Now, I thought this was a really interesting response. And so we had a conversation about that, and I have to say, I was a little bothered by it. And so I was trying to, afterwards, I was trying to think about what's bothering me about the fact that this, you know, very, to me, white-looking guy is checking off the black box. Now, I want to acknowledge that there are people with African ancestry who range in, you know, their physical appearance, and there have been, historically, folks who identified as African American who in fact had blonde hair, maybe even blue eyes, and who might quite legitimately feel like this is the box I should check. So I don't want to just say this is about physical appearance. But as far as I know, based on my conversation with this person, he had no African ancestry or no acknowledged African American ancestry, and so it was really just sort of an act of political resistance from his point of view. But what troubled me about it was that even though he didn't feel like he had been systematically advantaged, there were still ways in which he got the benefit of the doubt. We could talk about racial profiling, for example. You know, driving down the street in his car, if he has one, or a friend's car if he's borrowing one, he's less likely to be stopped by the police simply because of his skin color. So that's some privilege there. Walking into a store, he's less likely to be followed around. So there's some privilege there. Going to school in Hampshire, he's more likely to see professors who look like him than he will encounter black or Latino or Asian professors. There's some privilege there. I mean, there are many examples of ways we could identify privilege, though clearly his privilege is not the same as if he had come from a more economically affluent family. So when we think about it, you know, it's all relative, but clearly, just along the dimension of race, you can see privilege operating all the time. But not everybody sees it. It's like, I sometimes do an exercise. I describe this in my book, and so you may recognize it. I do this exercise. I used to teach, before I became dean of the college, introductory psychology, where I would ask students to fill in the following sentence. I am blank. Fill in the blank. As many different ways as you can think of in the next 60 seconds. And students would write all kinds of things. And they would write things like, I am tired. You know, I am, you know, I'm happy, I'm outgoing, I'm shy, I'm intelligent, I'm, you know, a lot of things. But they would also write, I'm African American, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Korean. But the white students rarely wrote, I am white. They didn't write, I'm European American. They, you know, maybe you'd have somebody write, I'm Irish or I'm Italian. You know, you might have somebody mention an ethnic group, especially if they came from a highly identified sort of ethnic enclave. But most of the time, they didn't mention race or ethnicity. There was a environment, and I have taught people in white environments, and when I did this in those schools, you would have the women write, I am female, usually on their list, there'd be some reference to gender, but the male students rarely wrote, I am male. If you had somebody who was comfortable mentioning sexual orientation, you might get somebody writing, I am gay or I am lesbian, but you didn't get hardly ever. In fact, I can really honestly say never, anybody writing, I am heterosexual on their list. I never had anybody write, I am two-legged. You know, so the fact is, to my knowledge, all of my students were. You know, but the fact is, if there were a student who had lost a leg through an accident or amputation or something, you know, it might, I am one-legged might have shown up on somebody's list. But the fact is that those pieces of our identity where we are in the majority, where we see ourselves as the norm, tend not to be focused on. So, you know, when I was mentioning all the different ways I'm privileged, I might have mentioned able-bodied, you know, but certainly not something I think about much, you know. When I walked into this auditorium, I didn't think of, you know, is this wheelchair accessible? You know, maybe it is. I mean, maybe there's a way to get in here with a wheelchair, but it's not a question I thought about. Right? So if you'd said to me, you know, your privilege, you know, was manifesting itself at that talk last night, I might have said to you, what are you talking about? You know, because I just wasn't thinking about it. And that is true, I think, for many white people relative to their racial privilege. They're just not thinking about it, they don't notice it. So when you talk about being systematically advantaged, it seems like, what are you talking about? And it's only after you start to really think about it and have conversations and point examples out, and when white people talk to each other about it, that the examples start to surface and the definition starts to make more sense. Yes?
You mentioned a few moments ago that people of color are racist because they don't systematically benefit. And it appears to me, at least from my position as a white male, that rappers of color and members of the self-proclaimed thug world do benefit from being anti-white. And I wanted to know your opinion on that.
Well, say more about that. I mean, in terms of how you think they benefit.
Well, at the very least economically, because they produce, the rappers that produce songs and raps that are based, at least in some part, on anti-white lyrics and on about how the man keeps them down, and along those lines, it would seem like by producing more albums with those themes, they would economically at the very least benefit from it.
Okay, so let me respond to your question. It seems to me what you're saying is that if a rapper, let's say a black or Latino rapper, has anti-white lyrics, that might increase the sales value, at least in some communities. And in that sense, they may be benefiting from their racial prejudice. Okay. And I would certainly say that if somebody is communicating an anti-white message, and we could talk about, whether we might not always agree, and I don't know specifically what things you are responding to, but let's just say it's very clear, everybody agrees it's an anti-white message, and that, and it's a reflection of racial prejudice. I would certainly say it's an example of racial prejudice. We might even talk about it as racial bigotry, racial hatred, blah, blah. There are many ways we could describe that. I would raise questions about whether there's any systemic, and by systemic I mean cultural, institutional policies and practices that are systematically advantaging that particular artist. Like, for example, getting playtime on the radio, right? Who is going to decide whether that particular record or CD is going to be played on the radio? Most radio stations are white-owned, almost all. So that the ultimate decision about whether a particular artist gets airtime is largely controlled by white people. If we think about, how that rapper is portrayed in the media, most, you can talk about BET, for example, Black Entertainment Television, as one potential outlet. But if you think about all the many channels on the television, access to those media outlets, again, is largely controlled by white outlets. So that while I think what you're saying is the message might appeal to a particular audience, and in that sense there's some benefit, much like we could say, Rush Limbaugh appeals to a particular audience. Particular messages appeal to a particular audience, and then to that extent there's some economic advantage. But I would argue that the biggest selling artists are less likely, the ones that really get, quote, mainstream and supported by the culture, supported by the institutional policies and practices, are not likely to fall into that category. And even when we think about rap artists who have achieved a high level of visibility, largely it's through the patronage of white youth. So that, I'm not sure I'm answering your question specifically, but I guess I don't see that it is systemically advantaged. I think you can always identify, sometimes students will say, or sometimes people will ask, you can always identify sort of subcultures or pockets. Like when somebody would say, well, like what if a white person went to an all-black town, right? Where the police force was black and the mayors were black, the mayor was black, and everybody was black. And he went into that town and the black people were prejudiced against the white people. Wouldn't they be being racist in that context? And I guess if you drew a bubble just around that town, you could say yes. You know, that the people in power, who has the power? You know, the black people have the power, and they are using their power to systematically advantage themselves, systematically disadvantage the white people who happen to come into that environment. But if you think in terms of the larger environment, you know, if you think even just in terms of the United States, we could talk beyond the United States, but if we just talk about the United States, you know, the white people who come into that town can then complain about that town and take it, you know, let's talk about something I just heard on the TV. The 60 Minutes program that comes on not on Sunday nights, but during the week. There was a program about Alabama State University. Did you see that? So this program, Alabama State University, is a historically black college, state-funded, however, in Alabama. And as you know, of course, Alabama has a history of segregation, and one of the things that the state has done to try to encourage white students to go to what has been a historically black college is to offer scholarships to, you know, to white students. A white student can go for free to Alabama State University if you meet a certain criteria, and it's a lower criteria in terms of grades and whatnot than black students need to meet to get scholarship assistance at that institution. And 60 Minutes went there and they interviewed some white students who were going to Alabama State University and asked them, why are you going there? And they said, because it's free. You know, and this is why I came here. The program is working. But it's a time-limited program. It's like a 5-year program, as I recall. And so one of the questions was, when the program runs out, will white students still go there? But let's use the Alabama State University system, I mean that particular institution as an example. If you're a white student there, you're in the minority. Now, many historically black colleges don't have a majority of black professors. They have certainly more black professors than other places do, typically. But there are often a lot of white professors there as well. And, but let's say there's a lot of black professors there, and there's a black president even, and those white students maybe feel like they're being systematically disadvantaged. In their classrooms, they're not being called on in class, maybe they feel like they're being graded more harshly, maybe they feel like they're being subjected to racial bias. And they might make the case that, you know, I'm being systematically disadvantaged in this environment. And, you know, I wouldn't argue if they felt that and there was reason to believe that that was true. I certainly wouldn't want to dispute somebody's lived experience. But the question I would ask is, you know, what avenue of recourse does that student have? You know, who's on the board of trustees? You know, is it a largely white board? Often historically black colleges have largely white boards of trustees. You know, the state legislators set up this program to help them get there. You know, write to your senator. Who is your senator? It's likely to be a white person who is going to be seeing things from your perspective. That they're, you know, take them to court. Who's going to be the jury? You know, that there are many systems in terms of, you know, thinking about how that would support their perspective. So it's, I think, a hard case to make. We might disagree about this, but I think it's a hard case to make in the context of the U.S. to talk about people of color systematically advantaged, if you look at all the systems operating. Yes? Uh-huh. So let me see if I understand the question. The question is, when you have a group of friends who are very comfortable with one another, can they use racial jokes? And I'm assuming that it's a racially mixed group, are you talking about? Yeah. So if you've got a racially mixed group and people are really comfortable with each other, is it okay to sort of tell racial jokes? Like, could a white person tell a joke about black or Latino people and vice versa? You know, obviously friends have their own. It's not like there's a rule about this, you know, that absolutely you should never tell racial jokes with your friends or your friends shouldn't tell them. But I think it's somewhat problematic. I wouldn't want my friends, I can speak for myself here, you know, I would not want my white friends to tell racial jokes around me, you know, and I would not, generally speaking, you know, I would not tell, you know, racial jokes about them. Now, I have to tell you that once you know, these jokes circulate on the internet, right? You get these jokes, and I got a joke on the internet that was sort of making fun of, I can't even remember now what the joke was, but I read it and I have to confess, I thought it was funny. And I forwarded it to a white friend. And I said to my white friend, there are not many white people I would forward this joke to, you know? And my friend wrote back to me and said, I'm really flattered, you know? And, you know, that is perhaps an example of what you're talking about. But in general, I think that those jokes tend to perpetuate stereotypes. And if I had any fear that my friend would have thought that this was really a good thing to repeat, you know, or that, that this was a stereotype that I wanted to reinforce, you know, I never would have sent it to that person. But the point is that, you know, and again, this is a place around which people might disagree. Several years ago, I said not too long ago, it now seems like quite a while ago, there was some time ago when I was doing a workshop talking about racial jokes or ethnic jokes, generally speaking, as a form of stereotyping, and talking about the ways in which they reinforce stereotypes, and for that reason, I thought people shouldn't tell them. And it was a largely white group with whom I was speaking, and there was another African-American woman in the room who was a participant. And she raised her hand and she said, I happen to think those jokes are funny. I don't mind if people tell them. And, you know, what's the big deal? Now, I didn't find this a particularly helpful comment, you know, in as much as I was trying to make this point. And so here's another black person saying, it's okay, you can tell them. And, but, you know, people disagree, right? And we can disagree about this. People disagree about the use of the N-word. You know, I think that it's a problem to use it. I think it's, you know, I avoid using it. I was watching Oprah today. While I was in the campus center, I got here about 4 o'clock. I turned Oprah on, and she was doing a show on the death penalty and talking about, she had some folks on her show who were, had been wrongly accused of murder, who were scheduled to be executed, and then just before they were exonerated and released from prison. So it was sort of an example of, you know, the risk we run when we, you know, potentially use the death penalty, that sometimes innocent people are killed, or could be killed. But anyways, they were talking about this. One of the people on her show was talking about his experience with the criminal justice system and police officers. He was an African-American man, and police officers who had called him repeatedly racial slurs, including the N-word, and he said the word, and he said, you know, I wondered if I could say this on the show. I know that you don't like this word. And Oprah said, well, you know, sometimes we allow it. You know, they had this whole conversation, but the point is that people disagree about these things. However, in this example that I was sharing, in terms of the joke telling, this black woman said, you know, I don't really mind the jokes, and then a white man spoke up, and it was I thought, a very useful comment. He said, you know, I used to feel that way too. I used to think that this was, you know, just having a sense of humor, what's the big deal? He said, but then I got to know someone who was Jewish, he said. And I, you know, used to have a lot of jokes, including some about Jewish people, and I, through my friendship with this, developing friendship with this person, discovered how hurtful those jokes were to this person. And then I felt like I couldn't tell them anymore. And now I'm not quite as much fun at parties as I used to be, but, you know, I feel like I can't tell them. What was really useful about his comment was not only that it offered another way of thinking about this question, but it also offered a way to interrupt the jokes. One of the things that you know, I'm conscious of the fact that, you know, time flies, it's already a little bit after 9. I want to talk about in some very concrete ways about how we can begin to interrupt this cycle. And joke telling is one small way that anyone can do this. How many of you have heard, you know, ethnic or racial jokes told around you? It's a very common experience, as we can see. A lot of people have their hands up. How many of you have heard somebody interrupt a joke after it's been told? Not as many of you. Some of you have. How many of you have interrupted the joke yourself? Okay, well maybe those are the people who say people who heard it done have done it. The fact of the matter is that when I talk to students in my psychology of racism class, a lot of them will say, you know, I hear these jokes, but it's unusual for me to hear anybody interrupt them. Or they say, I would like to interrupt them. It bothers me when people tell the jokes, but I don't know what to say. How many of you have fallen into that I don't know what to say category? A lot of people do. And I would like to share with you a very concrete strategy, which was actually used by the man I described in this context. It's the 3F strategy, right? FFF. Felt, found, feel. When you are talking to someone, it might be a joke, it might just be a comment, it doesn't have to be a joke, but somebody says something that has racist overtones or prejudicial overtones. You know, let's say, you can use it really in any context where you feel like somebody has said something that you find offensive, or that might have potentially offended somebody else in the room, and you want to say something about it. And one way to do that, if you're talking, for example, if I, as a black woman, am talking to another black woman who maybe says something homophobic, right? Or I'm talking to another heterosexual, and that person says something homophobic or tells a joke that I think is homophobic, and I want to speak up about it. I might do that in the following way. I might say, you know, I used to feel that way. You know, when I was growing up, I didn't know anything about, you know, I didn't hear people talking about gay or lesbians. I didn't really, you know, I had the same stereotypes that a lot of people had. And then I found out, you know, that at least 10% of the population is gay, lesbian, or transgendered, and bisexual, and some people that I care a lot about are in fact gay or lesbian, and now I feel that it's really problematic. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but I felt that way. I found out this new information. Now I feel X. And notice that when you do that, and it gets easier with practice, I have to say, but when you do that, you never once say, and you're an idiot, you know? That it is possible to sort of talk about this in a way that other people can hear you, and maybe even think a little bit about what you had to say. Now, sometimes when I tell this, you know, strategy, the 3F, somebody will say, well, what if you never felt that way? You know, what if somebody expressed such a horrible attitude, or, you know, was like so diametrically opposed to anything you might have ever experienced or thought in your life? What can you say then? Then you can say, you know, many people feel that way. You know, but then I found out X, you know. But it allows you to connect in some way with what that person's saying in a way that maybe helps them listen to your perspective and can move them forward. But there are lots of strategies for beginning to interrupt this cycle, and I would like to hear more from you in terms of, you know, I know you've read the book. The last chapter talks about strategies for interrupting. Do you have something you want to say about that? Okay, go ahead.
Kind of along the same lines as the last question, but for like comedians, you know, such as Chris Rock and Sinbad, how do you feel about them and the jokes that they make, and it's kind of reverse onto the white race? I was just wondering, you know, if that's the same kind of thing, if they're not interrupting the racism jokes, or they're promoting them, or what?
So I'm going to ask you, what do you think?
I don't know, I'm kind of afraid to answer, but I mean, I watch them on Comedy Central, and I'll admit that I laugh. I think they're very funny. You know, they show people in the audience, and some of the white people are kind of like, you know, like, they don't really get it. Like, all the black people are rolling on the floor, and, you know, and, so I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it would be a different situation if it were reversed. If it were a white comedian on the stage talking about blacks, or if it were a male, they're making jokes about a female. Whereas it's okay sometimes for a female to go up and make jokes about men and, you know, whatever. But I mean, I don't know. I guess I say that I laugh. I think they're funny, and I repeat sometimes the funny jokes that I hear Chris Rock or Sinbad say. I mean, as far as supporting them, I'm not sure how I feel.
Did you want to speak to that?
There is a white comedian who does do race-related jokes. His name is George Carlin or something like that. So it's not only like people of color comedians that do it as well. I just wanted to mention that.
Let's put your hands together.
I think that Chris Rock makes jokes about all people, like white and black people, and a lot of these jokes seem racist against black people to me when I hear them, and then I'll hear like my little brother repeating them, and I'm like, I don't want you talking that way, but he's like, Chris Rock said it, and I think that's another element to his humor.
Yeah. Is it the same?
A lot of the jokes we talk about have been sort of jokes directed at the other group by a group outside of that group. How do you feel about jokes sort of made within the racial, I mean, for instance, I'm Asian, and I know with my Asian friends, we sort of made maybe jokes about Asians, and I sort of think if a white person would tell those jokes to me, I might be offended, but within the community, to me, it seems all right. Do you think that's a form of internalized racism, or do you think that's all right?
Well, I'm going to ask you, what do you think?
Well, I don't know. I don't really know. I mean, I don't think it's, for some reason, it seems okay when we tell it within ourselves, but for some reason, it doesn't seem to me so.
I think that one of the issues that, I'm going to get to you, I think that one of the issues that we are addressing that's sort of surfacing in these questions has to do with power and what role does power play in the use of language, right? What kind of power is invested in the comedian who's of the dominant group, or when folks are talking within themselves, the target group is talking among themselves, what are the power dynamics versus when someone from the majority group speaks about that? And I'll say more about that, but I want to get to this person.
I just wanted to say to everybody that, if what those comedians were saying, like, I wouldn't use Chris Rock, I would use people like Bernie Mac, who like really, go into depth about black people, white people, whatever. If what they were doing was so wrong, then they wouldn't be making money. They wouldn't be millionaires doing it. And their whole audience is not black anyway.
Well, I'm going to beg to differ on that point. In the sense that, how many of you have seen, I want to just raise the, there's a film, which if you haven't seen it, I'd like to highly recommend, called Ethnic Notions. Raise your hand if you've ever seen this film, Ethnic Notions. We have a handful of us have seen this film. And those of you who haven't seen it, I would urge you to see it. And maybe they have it here in Hamilton, I don't know. But the film Ethnic Notions is a documentary which chronicles the stereotyping of African Americans in the media, right? From before the Civil War through certainly the 70s, 80s, probably the 80s, it goes up to the 80s probably. And what's really interesting are the role that black people have played in the perpetuation of some of these stereotypes. You can think about minstrel shows, you can think about, the Step and Fetch It character in films, where you have black actors playing very stereotypical roles, perpetuating those stereotypes, and getting paid a lot of money to do it. And so the fact that somebody is popular or successful doesn't necessarily mean it's not reinforcing the cycle of racism. In fact, I think probably the more, given the dominance of racism in our society, to the extent that somebody is playing into that sort of minstrel show character, the more likely it is to be embraced by the mainstream audiences. Now that doesn't address the question of what about the, in-house use of, for example, I'm somebody who does not use the N-word, as I'm going to refer to it here. I don't use it in my house. I don't want my kids to use it. It's not a word I use. However, I know that there are some young people who use it, who will say, it doesn't have the same meaning for me that it had for my parents' generation. It's, I'm using it affectionately to refer to my, buddies or my, close friends, and, there are lots of rationales that get used. And from my point of view, I think it's a manifestation of internalized racism. That would be my explanation. But, we might disagree about that. However, whether it's being used voluntarily or not I think it has a very different connotation when somebody outside that group uses it, because of the nature, the historical and current power dynamics change the use of the word. And much like, for example, there are terms that people who are gay or lesbian use within their own communities that they feel comfortable using, that I, as a heterosexual, would not want to use because I would feel it to be very disrespectful to use it. Just because somebody else is using it within the context of their own community doesn't give me the right to use it, okay? And sometimes when you're talking to younger people about this, like junior high school students or high school students, it's a little confusing to them. They'll say, I don't quite get this. And one analogy that I sometimes use, which can be helpful, is to think about it in terms of names your mother calls you. Right? There are things that your mother can call you that you wouldn't want anyone else to call you. Right? You know, and the reason she gets to call you that is because you have this close personal relationship and, you know, there's an intimacy there and, you know, she can get away with it. But that doesn't mean, you know, your teacher can call you that. It doesn't mean your friends can call you, you know, I mean, that there are rules for within group that are different than for out group. And that's just the fact of life. Now, we could talk about what does it mean that your mother calls you that, you know? And we might have multiple interpretations of that. But still, that may be something that operates within the context of your relationship with one another that doesn't mean other people can access it in that way. Yes?
I have a bit of a different question. It seems to me that you make reference to this institution that's been established so many years ago, and working with your objective definition of what racism is, and having noted that you've said that we can all be anti-racist, why does there seem to be this overwhelming sense of guilt by association? And does that not add to this bias and necessitate that the process become more difficult?
So, let me paraphrase your question. So if the question as I understand it, well, let me take the piece that struck me just as you were speaking, which is, what about this problem of guilt by association? Many white people do feel guilt by association. At least that's what gets reported to me. You know, my students talk about it a lot. They write about it in their journals. I do workshops. Many people will nod their heads and say, have led to feeling guilt by association? Yes. So let me talk about for a moment, I talk about this in the book, but let me talk about this for just a moment. One of the things I write about in the book is, you know, stages of white racial identity development, right? And that this is a process. Coming to understand what it means to be white in the context of a race-conscious society is a process. I mentioned that, you know, at the beginning of the semester in introductory psychology, you get a lot of white students who don't put white on their list, right? I am many things, but white's not one of the things that gets mentioned. They just aren't thinking about themselves as white, much as those of us with two legs aren't thinking about ourselves as two-legged, right? But when you're in an environment where you are surrounded by other people who are thinking about their race or ethnicity, or when you're in a place where the issues are being talked about, like in psychology of racism, one of the things that starts to happen is you start to think about your own whiteness, right? So we might start out, so sometimes students start out in a position like this. What whiteness? You know what I mean? Like, I didn't notice it. You know, I mean, I wasn't thinking about it, didn't notice it, wasn't part of my thinking. Now I'm in an environment where I am thinking about it, but I'm thinking about it in the context, often, of learning about this system of advantage. And that makes me feel guilty, because I didn't ask for that advantage, I didn't ask for privilege, you know, I mean, it manifests in lots of different ways, the way people talk about it, but, you know, people struggle with this. You know, I just was teaching my psychology of racism class on Tuesday, and some students were saying, you know, I really don't like thinking about myself as white. It feels uncomfortable to me. Right, so, and you have those conversations, you're made more conscious of it, and to the extent that it feels uncomfortable, one response to that is to stop having the conversations. You know, I'm not saying that's not the response I would recommend, right? That's not the response I'd recommend. But sometimes that happens. It's like someone shared with me a I was having a conversation here in Hamilton, and somebody was saying, I was reading somebody's book, and they had put a lot of comments in your book, in the first chapter. And then there weren't any more comments after that, which led that person to believe the person hadn't read past the first chapter. I don't know whether that's true or not, maybe they just got tired of writing comments. But the point was, in our conversation, the point was, it seemed as though this person was being made uncomfortable by what they were reading in the first chapter. And one response to that is to stop reading, right? If I don't have those conversations with Mr. Henderson, if I don't take that class, if I don't come to that talk, if I don't watch that video, I won't have to experience this discomfort. And I have an attendance requirement in my psychology of racism class. I take attendance, and it's the only class in which I regularly take attendance. And the reason I started taking attendance in that psychology of racism class is because I noticed around week 4, attendance would drop off dramatically. And it was about discomfort. Students would write in their journals, if I have to watch another one of those videos, I'm gonna just, lose it. I just am feeling so uncomfortable, I'm feeling so guilty, it really makes me upset, I can't deal with the subject matter, and therefore I want to withdraw from the conversation, and that is sometimes a response. And I think that institutions, one of the things that's great, I think, about Hamilton choosing my book or a book like it for the first year book and then having ongoing discussions about it, is that it helps people move beyond that discomfort, right? Sometimes what institutions do is they'll say, let's have a workshop on this topic. We're going to bring in a speaker and we're going to have a workshop, and then, it's a big deal is made for that day, but then there's no follow-up. And what happens in that environment sometimes is people get just enough information to feel uncomfortable, but not enough information to get beyond the discomfort. Not enough dialogue to get beyond the discomfort. But the fact is, the more you talk about it, the less uncomfortable you get. So you can start to move beyond that discomfort. Now, you might say, well, what does this, okay, so first I didn't notice my whiteness, then I started to notice it because of the conversations I was having, and it made me feel guilty or uncomfortable. And then what happens? Well, what happens then, sometimes, is that the person who continues to have the conversation will start to say, I am bothered by those jokes. I am bothered by the comments I hear people making. I am bothered by the fact that there are no people of color on the syllabus. I'm going to speak up about that. How many of you had that experience? Starting to feel bothered and then as a consequence motivated to take action? There's some people in the room who know what I'm talking about here. So you get bothered and you want to do something about it. And when you try to do something about it, what happens to you? Somebody who knows, tell us. You get attacked. You want to tell us more about that?
On vacation with some friends who were deliberately being racist, and I told them how much it bothered them, and they enjoyed it so much they kept it up, saying, yes, I am racist, and enhanced the racism.
So people tend to respond with, what's wrong with you? That there's a kind of, sometimes, it's like, let's use that cycle analogy, right? It's like you're on the cycle. At first you're on the cycle, and I'm speaking now about white identity development, right? It's like white people are on the cycle and not noticing it, not aware of it. And if you grow up in an all-white neighborhood, why would you? Right? It's not being talked about, you don't have a context for it, and so you don't notice it. And so maybe you go to college and you have a roommate of color. And then you and your roommate, maybe you're not even talking about issues of race, but you and your roommate go shopping together, and you notice that your roommate gets followed around at the mall and you don't. Or maybe you notice that things happen. Your roommate's, at Mount Holyoke, it's a women's college, the roommate's boyfriend comes to visit. Let's say it's a black woman with a black boyfriend, and you notice that her boyfriend gets asked for his ID more often than the white guys who are walking around. You start to notice things that you didn't notice before, and that makes you more aware of your own whiteness. And you start to speak up about that, let's imagine. And then you get feedback from other people who, also weren't noticing. And just as when you noticed you started to get uncomfortable, when you point it out to other people, you make them uncomfortable, right? So the people who are uncomfortable around you will say, stop noticing, stop talking about it, stop interrupting my jokes, what happened to your sense of humor? You know, that kind of stuff starts to happen. And it's as though you are trying to step off the cycle, and people in your environment are saying, get back on, right? And when that happens, sometimes people do get back on. Now you might say, how can you get back, how can you not notice after you have noticed? It's like if I were to ask you to notice, I'd be right with you, I see your hand. If I ask you to notice that these chairs are rust-colored, and then I ask you to focus on that rust color, and then I ask you, now, I'd like you to forget these chairs are rust colored. You know what I mean? It would be hard to do. It would be hard to get that out of your head once you've noticed. So once you start to notice the cycle, it's hard not to notice. But one thing that sometimes happens when people start to notice, and one way to deal with their discomfort about having noticed, is to blame the victim. If only the people who are targeted by racism would stop talking about it. You know, if only, you know, the people who are being targeted by this ism would stop, quote, flaunting it, whatever that means. You know, if only they would change, then the ism wouldn't be a problem. And when we take that kind of approach, it allows us to stay on the cycle. We don't have to do anything. We just have to wait for them to change, right? I don't have to take responsibility for it if it's their problem. So that is one way that sometimes people resolve this conflict. But if you're in an environment where your thinking is continually being challenged, like you're taking a course where you're spending all semester talking about it, and you keep seeing more films, and you keep having more conversations, and you know, it's kind of hard to keep saying it's just them when there's so much evidence to suggest otherwise, you might get to a place where you say, you know, I get that this is a problem, I really do want to step off this cycle, but I can't figure out how to do it because I don't know anybody who has. And that, I think, is where sometimes white people get, where they are wanting to acknowledge their privilege as being white, they're wanting to be anti-racist, but they don't necessarily know how because they haven't seen other people do it. And when you think about the models, I wrote an article about this once and I talk about it in the book. If you think about the models of whiteness, there is on one hand the what whiteness? I didn't notice. You know, that's sort of the not noticing model. Then there's the guilty model, which is uncomfortable, as we've already been talking about. Then there is the white supremacist model, right? Sometimes when people think about acknowledging their whiteness, they think about, you know, white power, Klan membership, skinhead stuff. For many people, that's unattractive. I'd like to think most people find that unattractive. And then, so what else is there? You know, if it's, you know, white supremacy, we want to reject that one. If it's not noticing, too late for that. If it's, you know, guilty, that's uncomfortable. What else is there? And I think that there is something else. But that's the place where I think, speaking as an educator, it really becomes important to provide examples of what else is there. You know, there is the white person who's learned how to walk fast in the other direction, who is actively anti-racist, who is a white ally. There's a long history of white allies, white people who have worked against racism, but most white students don't know about those people. How many of you can name, I'm going to ask this question, if you've read this in the book, you'll remember this part, but how many of you can name a well-known white person, I'm being very intentional about my choice of words, a well-known white person who you would consider to be actively racist? Raise your hand if you can think of a well-known white person you would consider to be actively racist because of public statements they've made, actions you've heard about. A lot of you are raising your hand. You know, you can think of at least one person who falls into this category. When I ask this question, most people do raise their hands. You can think of the name, I'll tell you the name that most frequently comes up. It came up in an earlier conversation today. That was the name of David Duke. How many of you had thought of David Duke? Okay. David Duke, for those of you who are wondering who's David Duke, was at one time a head person in the Ku Klux Klan, later ran for Senate in Louisiana, you know, tried to distance himself from the Klan, but for a long time was associated with the Klan, and many people think of him when they think of a well-known white person who they consider to be racist. Now, however, if I were to ask you to think of a well-known white person who you know because of what they say and do is actively working against racism, raise your hand if you've thought of somebody. Notice there are a lot fewer hands up. Okay, there are people you can name. Somebody who raised her hand or his hand, give me an example. I'm sorry? Norman Siegel. Morris Dees is another name I heard. Morris Dees is the one I hear most often, right? For those, how many of you know who Morris Dees is? Okay. Those of you who don't, Morris Dees is a white man from the South, a lawyer, who co-founded the Southern Poverty Law Center, has been very active in anti-Klan litigation. The Southern Poverty Law Center does a lot of work prosecuting in the cases of hate crimes, as well as publishing videos and magazines. Okay, magazines, and there's somebody in the back I promised to get to. So anyway, Morris Dees is a common example, but there are other people you can mention. But the fact is that a lot of white students, and students of color as well, do not know these names. So when you say, there's more than one way to be white, you don't have to just feel guilty. You can identify, you can take pride in the history of white, active, anti-racism activism. You can only take pride in that if you know about it. I think you need to make that very more visible. It's as though you want to step off the cycle, but you don't know how to do it because you haven't seen other people do it. And so I think providing examples and models of that is very important. And it also benefits students of color to know that it is possible to have white allies. That it is possible to work in coalition with people across lines of difference toward interrupting this cycle. Now there was a hand in the back, and I promised to get to you.
Yeah, this is not on what you're talking about at the moment. I just want a small clarification on the terms. We say racist to mean discrimination by race. We say sexist to mean discrimination by sex. Ageist for age. But we say homophobic. Phobic meaning fear.
We could also say heterosexist.
Okay. Against people who are heterosexual.
Heterosexist means, heterosexist refers to a system of advantage based on sexual orientation. You're absolutely right that the words don't always work across isms, but often when we talk about systems of advantage relative to sexual orientation, heterosexist is the word that gets used. Homophobia is also a word that gets used in terms of, the fear that many people have, or and literally what it means is fear of homosexuals, that's what the term means, but it's often used to describe the acts of hatred or bigotry that are directed toward people who are gay, lesbian, or bisexual.
That's what I'm saying. Why is that the more common term that's used? Or at least for me, that's the common term that I hear is homophobic instead of homosexist.
I have never heard the term homosexist, and I don't know the answer to your question. I can tell you what the commonly used term is. But I think it's important to talk about, and without getting too distracted here, I think it's important to just acknowledge that our language doesn't work. It's hard to talk in a reasonable way about an unreasonable thing, right? Racism, sexism, heterosexism, homophobia, whatever you want to use, anti-Semitism, classism, are unreasonable things. When we talk about racial categories, race is a social construct. It's biologically meaningless, right? Racial differences are biologically meaningless, and yet we talk about them like they're real. I talk about this in the book, that it's very hard to come up with language that works when you're talking about something that is fundamentally illogical. So we are limited by that language. So anyway, I appreciate your point, and I would just want to acknowledge that our language is not perfect. Another point that sometimes comes up is the term anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is usually used in the context of U.S. society to refer to anti-Jewish feelings, or attitudes. But Semites, Semitic people, are not only Jewish. We could talk about Arabs as Semitic people. But when we say anti-Semitism, we're not usually talking about anti-Arab feeling, we're usually talking about anti-Jewish feeling. So we need to be more precise in our language in lots of different ways. There was a hand way in the back.
Yes, this is to refer to a question earlier about the jokes and the movies. My point is that the black comedians that actually make the joke about the white, I'm not saying it's inoffensive or it's less important as if it was a white person that would make jokes about black people, but I think it would be taken in a more serious way because there is a history behind it. The only reason why the black people that make fun, that have jokes about white people are not really pointed, they're not really accused or whatever the case is for it, is because what is the oppressed history, like, that white people had from black people? So.
Well, I think what you're speaking to is the power differential, and I think that that's a very important point to make. And it speaks to, you know, one of the things that we talk about in I teach this course on the psychology of racism, and we talk about the way, you know, racism manifests itself, but there is research about some of this, and a lot of it actually, and some of the research has to do with stereotyping, the way stereotyping works. And it is, I'm going to take a moment to think of her name. Susan Fisk is a social psychologist who's done a lot of research on stereotyping, and one of the things that she says is that stereotyping is much more common from the top down than the bottom up, right? That it's much more common for the dominant group to stereotype the targeted group than for the targeted group to stereotype the dominant group. And one of the reasons that is, it's not just about who's a nice person and who's not, it's about need to know. As a person who's targeted, you need to be able to figure out how the people to whom you feel less powerful are differentiating. It's like if you are a woman who is worried about being abused by her husband, right? One of the things that we know about women who have been battered is they get very sensitive to changes in their partner's mood. They're paying very close attention because they need to pay attention in order to protect themselves, right? If you are being targeted, you need to pay very close attention to the person who's your potential targeter, right? And as a consequence of paying close attention, you're less likely to stereotype because you see the individual variation. You need to be able to see that individual variation to successfully maneuver in your environment. But if you're in a more powerful position, you don't have to necessarily pay as close attention. You know, if you're the employee, you better remember your employer's name, you know, but your employer doesn't necessarily have to remember your name, right? Because of the power differential. And stereotyping works in the same way, and I think that that's part of the dynamic when we talk about the impact of the jokes and who's telling them. You've been waiting to speak.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you, why is it that African Americans can realize that we've been systematically oppressed as far as not getting jobs and always being stopped by the police, but we have a hard time realizing that we oppress each other by not accepting who we are physically and not liking being black? And why is it that we can't realize that oppression, but can realize the other can't get a job?
I think it's because it's not talked about enough. I mean, you know, I think as I started out, maybe it's a good place to end, you know, that you can't solve a problem unless you talk about it. There is a lot of silence in communities of color about internalized racism. You know, there are a lot of families that don't want to talk about colorism, for example, that don't want to talk about, you know, negative attitudes or they get expressed about one's physical appearance, whether that's hair texture or, you know, body size or whatever it might be. And the silence allows it to go uninterrupted. So I think that's, you know, people talk about not being able to get a job. They don't necessarily talk about, you know, familial attitudes and how those are being communicated. With that, I think we probably should wrap, but I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm glad you're here.